We're going to be in Ecclesiastes this morning, taking a little break from our study of Acts to look at a different text. By way of introduction, I want you to wonder and suppose whether or not someone born in 1899, at the end of the last century before the century that we're on now, if that person would be able to imagine the world that we live in today. A world where we are transported by cars and planes, and we have space exploration. A world in which we have television and movies and iPods and smartphones and the internet. A world in which diseases that plagued humanity at the turn of that century are now cured. Where you can have heart transplants and heart bypasses. Where an average ordinary person can live past 70 and beyond. Would they even imagine such a world? But I ask you, has the world really changed since then? What remains the same through all those endless changes is the question that Solomon raises for us this morning with our text, and we'll begin with verse 4 of chapter 1. It says, "Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever." And that talks about the perspective that we have as mortal men and women. You see, we are the only thing that God created in this world that is self-aware enough to contemplate the generations that have come before us and to wonder about the generations that will follow us. When we see ourselves thus as a link in a long chain of humanity stretching back to our ancestors, we realize how temporary our stay on this world really is. You see, it is all that we have ever known. This is the only existence that you or I know. But we know that it will end one day. That whatever tasks and projects and hopes we have, whether completed or not, must one day be handed down to others to continue. We live in a world that experiences rapid change, and it seems more rapid as every day goes by. It feels as if our world is in constant flux, that everything is changing. But the question is everything really changing? You see, Solomon said in verses 5 through 7, "The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it goes," to where it rises. "The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again." You see, the more things change in our world, the more they seem to stay the same. If you contemplate the repetitive processes of life on earth, if you look at the seasons as they come and go, if you look at the water cycle as it continues to reuse the same water that Abraham himself drank, that water is still in use today as it goes through the cycle. They are all seemingly continuing without care to what we do or don't do here on this planet. You see, I know it's popular today to view our presence on this planet as a very determinative force, that humanity is very important to what's happening here. But the sun will rise and set tomorrow, whether we are good stewards of our creation or not. You see, God created this world with a marvelous ability to be a self-sustaining system. It's every facet able to be rebalanced over time. I've heard a lot since I came here about how this river valley was at the turn of the century, with most of the trees chopped down and lots of erosion issues and oil wells everywhere. If you didn't know that history, you wouldn't think that if you looked out on them now, with mature forests on the slopes. And the only thing left in those woods are the occasional pipe and the occasional oil derrick still sticking there. Much has changed over the last 100 years. It is such a complicated system. It is so far beyond our ability to control that we can often barely predict what will happen next. We think we know what tomorrow's weather will be, but how often is that wrong? We cannot think that such a system would be the product of chance. No matter how many planets exist in our universe, and they find more every year, another one so perfectly situated and constructed for life is not out there. This is not an accident. This system, this planet that we live on. So if we are so transitory, so brief, and our planet is so resilient, the question becomes, what can we do in our lives that will have a lasting impact? It can only be through our efforts that benefit our fellow man around us, that we will have an impact that will last for the generations to come. If we hope to leave anything behind except for a gravestone, we must work for the benefit of others and not simply indulge in our own desires. You see, Solomon understood something else about living. He said in verse 8, all things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. It reminded me of the song that I heard on the radio when I was a kid. You load 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. You're not getting anywhere. You see, there is a very good reason why we don't live to be 300 years old. We would become far too weary of our day-to-day existence. Those who have sought in vain throughout history for immortality in this world are perhaps some of the greatest fools who have ever lived. Because if they had received which they sought, if they had found life that went on and on, in the end it would have been for them far more of a curse than a blessing. A writer that you know I'm a fan of, Tolkien, understood this when he wrote that mortality, that death, was a gift to mankind. One that the immortal elves in his writing did not understand or even envy at first. But as the countless years, as the thousands of years that they lived wore on, they wearied of living. And they understood the gift that mankind had. So why does simply living lose its luster in the end? Why do we get tired of it? Because this existence is not what God intended when He created us. The effects of sin upon our world are so prevalent and so profound that we can hardly imagine what living without them would be like. Thus it is not the prospect of everlasting life that makes heaven appealing to us. It is life without pain and fear and anxiety and depression and hurt and sorrow and loss and temptation. Such an existence seems beyond our ability to grasp, and we can hardly imagine what it would be like. But we know that it would be amazing. And that is the sort of life that we would want to last forever. Solomon continues in verse 9 when he says, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. I started by talking about all those new things. Well, the great science fiction writer Isaac Asimov wrote a masterpiece called The Foundation Series. And in it, the premise was that history was cyclical and not linear. Let me explain that. He meant that history went in circles, from one pace back around to where it started again, and not linear like in a straight line. We here in the West have been influenced by the Greeks, and the Greeks believed that life was linear, that it did go in a straight line. But we're not the only ones in this world, and other people have had a different view. You see, many in the East, like the Hindus of India or the Buddhists of Southeast Asia, instead view life as a circle. It ends where it began, and thus they have the concept and the belief in reincarnation. Well, Asimov, when he was writing his science fiction, was not expressing an Eastern philosophy. He was actually agreeing with Solomon that human existence is nothing new. that each generation may feel like what they are witnessing is novel and unique. But the history books are full of similar things, both good and bad. Each chapter in a book of history reads like the same story over and over again. Maybe that's why so many kids in school don't enjoy it. The question is then, how can the future be different than in today? How can the future be any different than the life we're living now? Asimov's main character sought to change humanity's future. That's what he wanted to do, make the future better. But he realized that to change the future, only one thing would make a difference, and that would be to change human nature. As long as humanity remains enslaved to sin and our sin nature, the future will be no better than the past. World War I was called the war to end all wars, was it not? But it was less than a generation later when World War II was being fought. The Holocaust was supposed to have taught us a lesson to last for all time. But we forget that it followed after the genocide in Armenia by the Turks during World War I, when more than 1 million people were killed. And that right after that, Mao began his cultural revolution and killed millions of his own people. And then after that came the killing fields of Cambodia. And after that, the massacres in Rwanda. And the ongoing destruction and killing in Somalia and the Sudan. Nothing has changed. We have not learned much of anything because humanity is utterly incapable of changing itself. Solomon continues verses 10 and 11. He says, "Is there anything of which one can say, 'Look, this is something new'? It was here already long ago. It was here before our time. There is no remembrance of men of old, and even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow." We spend a lot of time in our society talking about things that are new and improved. We have an industry, an advertising industry that specializes in convincing consumers that a new and improved version of a product that has been around for years is actually better than the one you used to buy. Now, they tried to convince us of this back in the 80s with a product called New Coke, and people didn't buy it. They said we like the old one better. But that is a rare exception to this phenomenon, because I guarantee that when the newest version of the iPhone comes out, as it just did, and the new one will come later, everyone will be saying how much cooler this new one is. As bewildering as our information society has quickly become, with its new marvels unveiled to oohs and ahs on a regular basis, the question yet remains, is there anything actually new here? Now, young people might be a little skeptical at this line of thought, but bear with me. You see, at first glance, the answer seems obvious. Of course this is new. That's why they call it an invention, because it didn't exist before. But if you strip away the gadget and you look at the purpose, it becomes clear that the idea behind it has not changed. It may be a more efficient or a more convenient way of doing things than people used to do, but modern technology is still doing the same old things, moving people from A to B, making communication possible between people, and sharing ideas, all of which have been around before. You see, when Jesus walked, imagine that, on his feet from town to town and gave open-air sermons to vast crowds, he was doing the exact same thing that anyone today would do by a podcast or a blog or by sending a text. He was sharing information. So I ask you, is it any better now than it was before? Well, again, at first glance, the answer seems clear. How could it not be better to send an instant message than to wait a month for the Pony Express to deliver your letter? There is always a trade-off, though. Each new method for doing something old has a positive and a negative side. Perspective might help us understand this phenomenon. Let's go back a couple hundred years to the Industrial Revolution. It was a huge boon to human productivity and to overall standards of living, but there was a cost. There was a cost of devaluing the work of the individual, as men who were artisans, masters of their craft, were replaced by assembly line workers, whose conditions and working conditions were horrendous. Yes, we made more stuff, but at a cost. And now in our society, there is emerging evidence that was just on the front page of Newsweek a little bit ago, that all of our hyper-connected way of living, of being 24/7 dialed in, is causing serious brain addictions amongst people and giving people stresses that were unheard of and unknown before. These are the unintended consequences of being available 24/7. There are many people for whom now they cannot get away from their job. They have to be reachable every day, all the time. And I know many a teenager who will not shut their phone off when they go to bed at night, because what happens if someone sends me a text at 3 a.m.? And they literally get up and answer it. You or I might shake our heads and wonder, but I know it's true. The fascinating thing about the internet is that it makes available information that would have been hard to find in the past. You would have had to go into a library and spent time looking amongst the stacks for this bit of information that you can Google in a moment. Or that information may have been limited to only certain people that had access to it. Yet with all of this knowledge floating around for anyone to grab, I ask you, are we getting any wiser? Even if we discount the vast amounts of false and outright harmful information that are mixed in with it on the internet, has the internet offered us anything new that really matters? The reality is that the important questions in life, there are really only two of them. Who am I and why am I here? They have been asked originally by people who carved their answers in stone. They are not new questions. And the answers that they found were as equally unsatisfying as those offered today, with one exception. There was a small and seemingly insignificant group of people who recorded answers that they had not come up with themselves. They recorded answers that they had been given by a God who introduced himself to them as I am. You see, every attempt to find answers to our fundamental questions on our own, apart from revelation from God, have been one dismal failure after another. Solomon knew all the answers that you can find today, and they were meaningless and futile and have not improved a bit. Why? Because they cannot change human nature. The only answer that matters is one that can change who we are. The rest is simple repetition of the failures that have gone on before. Solomon understood this dilemma as well. He said, there is no remembrance of men of old. That doesn't mean that old men are forgetful. That means that we don't remember what happened before. Winston Churchill said, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And he wasn't talking about failing the class. He was talking about people not learning lessons. And he was right. Because each new discovery that somehow tells us why man doesn't need God, like this recent information about the Hadron Collider, the God particle has been found. We don't need to explain to have God anymore. Or that some new, or that somehow man can now improve or correct ourselves by our own effort. It is not a new solution. It is simply a failure to remember the past. Let me give you a brief rundown of the ones that just popped into my head. Plato thought more than 2,000 years ago that he could perfect human society through philosophy. He said, if I simply tell people what is right, to know the good is to do the good, they will do it. But they didn't. And then along came the Buddhist who said, no, the answer is nirvana. We need to meditate and realize that existence is not real. They haven't figured that out yet. Or the Hindus who have said, no, we're actually stuck in an endless cycle of reincarnation from which there is no escape. And I'm not sure why that was supposed to be helpful. Then along came a man named Karl Marx, and he said what we need is a brotherhood of the workers, so that we are all equal and free. And people took his ideas and enslaved those workers instead. After him was a man named Nietzsche, who said actually what we need is a superman, a superhuman race, a master race. And we all know what happened with that idea. A man named Hitler thought that was brilliant. It introduced us to the horrors of the Nazis. I could go on and on. Because each new fad, each new trend is simply a rehash of an earlier failure. Apart from divine intervention, there is no hope. One of the reasons why people don't see it is because they don't know the countless generations before them that have tried and failed to find peace and hope through human effort. So how do we break that chain of repetition? How do we find hope and peace? It seems as if Solomon's message for us this morning is pretty depressing. Well, Solomon knew the problem. It was as clear in his day as it is in ours. Nothing short of a fundamental overhaul of human nature will be sufficient to bring about an actual new improvement to the human condition. Now, we're not talking here about a slight improvement or a marginal change. What we do not need is a 3% improvement. What we need is real and dramatic and permanent shift in every asset of humanity. We need to change our thoughts and our emotions and our attitudes and our goals and our dreams and our hopes, every bit of it. Here's where an act of faith becomes necessary. You see, the catch in this is that you need to stop trying to fix yourself and turn over to God the control that He asks for. As long as a person remains self-assured and unwilling to be humble before God, nothing can be accomplished. So what is the solution to Solomon's dilemma? Solomon knew that the sacrificial system that he lived under, of avoiding God's wrath with the blood of animals, could never make a person clean. We learned that in our study of Hebrews in Bible study on Wednesday. The process had to be repeated endlessly, every time, again and again. What was needed was a sacrifice that would be effective enough that it would last. And the only way that it would last is if it truly made a sinner clean before God. For that, you would need a sacrifice from above, a perfect offering that would allow man to approach God through grace and allow God to begin the transformation process that would finally put an end to hopeless repetition. You see, that sacrifice has been made. It has been accepted by God, and it has been made available to all. You see, when Christ died on the cross, His sinless blood was shed for the whole world. And when He rose from the grave, it proved that His sacrifice had not been in vain. There are only two alternatives for every man, woman, and child living on the face of the earth today. Number one, simply continue as you are. Remain trapped in an endless cycle of futility, and one day God will give you on the day of judgment what you seek. Separation from Him forever. Or the second option, admit your defeat, approach God in humble faith, and accept that His Son's sacrifice on your behalf is necessary to change you from being a sinner without hope to being a sinner saved by grace. You see, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This choice has been defining human existence for thousands of years. The latest gadget, the latest gizmo that comes out is not going to keep you from needing to decide for yourself.